This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 132 of Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. Today's episode is titled Beyond the Report Page. Our job doesn't stop with the report. In fact, in some cases, that's only where it begins. You see, in a report, we address not only what we deem to be a concern, but also what we know to be of interest to the customer. In some cases, however, there's a miscommunication, or rather a lack of communication about what they were hoping to learn, maybe what they expected in the comment, and what was actually on the report page. In this particular instance, the viscosity was of note. The customer had sent in one sample prior. It was a 0.16. The second sample read like a 0.16. But because of the oil type not being listed on the slip, we had it logged in our system as gasoline engine oil. That's where the action begins, or really with the first email that took place after we sent out the report. Because in that report, I primarily focused on aluminum. It was an element that was unusually high, both compared to averages and the last sample. It was the dominant metal, and we just don't expect that amount of piston or bearing wear from that particular engine. So I used the comment to both address aluminum as well as potential explanations for the increase and next steps with regards to mileage on the following sample, so on and so forth. However, the customer followed up with an email detailing how they were wondering where the viscosity information was. Now, in cases where the oil type is not listed on the slip, we'll do what I mentioned before often, which is logging it in as generic gasoline or diesel engine oil. Now, we can, of course, note where the viscosity read. And we can always do that. If you're interested in the viscosity, say you just bought the car, you don't know what the oil was going in, we can tell you, no problem. So here's the thing, or rather things about viscosity. It can change while that oil is in use, especially if there's additives, contaminants, maybe you have an engine that shears the oil down. A lot of reasons why that viscosity can fluctuate, and that informs why if you don't know the oil type starting out, it means a great deal to say the viscosity is quote unquote normal. Now, in this case, it probably would have been a safe bet to call it normal in the sense that the engine type isn't one that's apt to shear the oil. There weren't additives or contamination that were likely to skew the result. But again, going back to the oil information slip, the viscosity wasn't a focal point that we were aware of on the customer end. And we had bigger fish to fry in the comment in the sense that we saw results that were obviously out of the typical range. We want to talk about those, talk about what could be influencing them. But unbeknownst to us, the viscosity actually was the main reason that this customer was sampling. And they went on to explain in their email that they don't put down what the oil type should be because they aren't sure, and they want us to tell them what the shop actually used. Basically checking to confirm that the shop did their job. Fortunately, this is a situation where we didn't have a reason to doubt that the right or wrong oil was used. The viscosity was well within range, right on par with the previous 0.16. But this taps into, I think, analysis and how you can go about it the right or the wrong way, in that in general, it's not really correct to simply log in an oil as where it ended up. And I want to talk about a few examples why. Let's start with the 6.0 Power Stroke. That engine is known to harmlessly shear the oil down. Shearing is a result of a breakdown of viscosity, improving additives in the oil, and what happens is the viscosity ends up usually being below the expected range for whatever oil type you're sampling. You use a 540, it may end up reading more like a 1030. So if we were in a case where a 6.0 sample arrives, the viscosity reads in the 1030 range, and we just log it in as a 1030 and then say, yep, viscosity is a 1030. And say it's another example where the customer is primarily using analysis to check the work of a shop. Well, then they would have ammunition to go to the mechanic and say, you gave me a 1030 because that's where the viscosity read. Which, of course, thanks to oil analysis, we know that that's not the case at all. If there's an absence of fuel or any other solvent-based product that could affect the flash point, the viscosity, so on and so forth, then we know that a low viscosity in that case isn't alarming. Going beyond that, there can be additives such as Lucas. So if a customer mentions that they're running Lucas, they also mention that they are running a 520 and the oil ends up reading thicker than that due to Lucas being a viscosity improving additive. If we were to simply note the viscosity was a 530, same thing. We run to a case where simply calling the oil what it is a tricky endeavor and it doesn't take everything into account. Yet another example that I relayed to the client in our email exchange was that owners often change oil types. So let's say in this particular instance, the owner had switched from a 016 to a 520. Well, the viscosity may have read closer to a 016 than it would have for a 520 if that's their first sample after making the change, due to carryover from the previous fill, thinning the next fill down. So remember, if the oil type is blank on the slip and we have no information, if they just made the change to a 520, but they were running 016 prior, and the viscosity skews closer to that thinner grade, and we just mentioned the viscosity is in the 016 range. Again, you have a situation where that can be read as the incorrect oil being put in terms of what they asked for, what they expected, and what they got. So keep all of that in mind when we circle back to this report, wherein no oil type is on the slip, and again, we don't know that the viscosity is necessarily a point of interest either. So that's where the confusion came in. Expectation of a certain data point being relayed in a particular fashion, that being the oil simply being logged in as where it measured, which you could argue that we can assume in some cases, but assumption is simply not a reliable way to go about oil analysis. But with all of that being said, I don't blame the customer at all for there being some confusion on their end. And that's really why I wanted to address this particular exchange, this type of scenario on the show, because I find that it's not unusual for people to have assumptions about oil analysis and sort of why people have it done. A few years ago, for example, I stumbled upon a YouTube video where the host was interviewing a fleet manager, and he was asking him questions about oil analysis, and then towards the end of the video, he asks, so would you use it on your vehicles? And the fleet manager just turns his nose up and goes, well, no, I don't want to run longer between oil changes, so why would I use it? And meanwhile, I'm just putting my head in my hands and just being like, well, to check the condition and see if any of them has a problem and to keep them running and to understand if you're dealing with contamination, the oil breaking down, wear level. I mean, come on. Like, obviously to me, this is all very present in my mind all the time. But that video is nevertheless a good example of keeping in mind that oil analysis is one thing to some people. It's many things to others. And you have to meet people where they're at. So in this particular instance, the report missed the mark for what the customer was anticipating. Now, I also want to talk about the scenario to encourage all of you to list any potential concerns or problems that you're looking for or points of interest, because whether we find a problem or we know of something that you're interested in any case, that's all going to be relayed, be it in the form of the report, a phone call, an email. We'll get it done, whether the comment space allows for it or not. And while we are skilled at delivering a nuanced evaluation of your motor, psychology is a little bit trickier in the sense that we can't read your mind and we can't assume what you want to know beyond, of course, usual suspects like M3 owners and bearing wear, or Jeep 4.0s and the adventures of head gasket repairs. There's a wide world of oil analysis and things that folks are hoping to learn. So if you are in an instance where you're expecting a result or maybe something is particularly of interest to you, feel free to write that on the oil information slip, and we'll let you know whether or not those results matched expectations. And if they didn't, we can explain why or why not. But keep in mind that whatever you're running with whatever engine you have, the results that we obtain, or that any lab can obtain using the ASTM methods that we rely on, they're influenced by a variety of factors. So having all the variables at our disposal means a great deal. For example, some engines wear differently than others. So taking a element at face value and deciding whether or not that shows extra wear is heavily dependent upon the motor it came from and the mileage or hours or track weekends it took to develop that amount of metal content in the used oil. Same goes to the physical properties. I can certainly respect wanting to know if the shop or whoever changed the oil did the right thing. But before you make that determination, you need to understand all of the factors that can inform a result. Just to wrap things up, I'll talk about a sample I looked at today where the customer was primarily concerned about the shop not changing their oil because of the color not meeting their expectation after about 1,500 miles on the oil. Now, as for the results, the oil actually, well, it looked quite good in testing. Had a lot of active additive left, had a viscosity that was just a hair thin, probably due to the mild amount of fuel that was present, but really not a concerning result at all, especially when you consider how well the engine was wearing with that oil being in use. But still, the appearance of the oil was nevertheless a concern for the customer. So in the report, I detailed what we found as well as what we didn't find, because you can cross off at least potential problems from your list by knowing what we didn't find as well as what was in the used oil. And we didn't find excess dirt or debris. We didn't find the oil to be unusually sooty. We didn't find a lot of solids that would suggest excess heat being a factor. And again, the viscosity was slightly thin, not thick like it would be if heat damage was an issue. So by taking all of these factors, we can rule out the likely situation, the likely explanation for the oil's appearance is mixing with the carryover from the past fill, as well as the oil simply doing its job of cleaning and lubricating. There's certainly no contamination or evidence of excess heat to inform that result. So that's what I explained in the comment. Because the customer let us know it was a concern, we made sure to address it in the comment. But we understand at the same time that some customers may get into oil analysis with certain expectations where they wouldn't think to write, let's say, this suspicion or concern or particular data point they're interested in because they assume it will be there just as a fact of the matter. And that's okay. Feel free to reach out either by giving us a call or sending an email like this customer did, because I don't bring this up at all to discourage contact beyond the page. This is part of the job. And it's an opportunity for us to always fine-tune how we write a comment, how we respond, and finding the most effective way to break down results that help the customer out. Because importantly, this email exchange ended in a positive manner. They were pleased to learn the detailed breakdown as to why we made certain clerical decisions, as well as my continued explanation of the viscosity and why it likely was 016. No need to run to the shop and assume the wrong product was used, and letting them know what goes into the process. There's a wide world when it comes to oil analysis, and we're just here to help you find your way. That brings today's show to a close. Thank you so much for listening. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.